If you were raised to believe that you're nothing but a burden and you were neglected, you weren't cared for the way you needed, and then you start taking ownership of how you treat yourself, you realize, oh, wait, I'm an adult now and I get to choose how I live my life and how I treat myself. And so it's very empowering.
Two people can go through the exact same trauma, and how they deal with it and manage it can be completely different.
Welcome to Season 2 of Students of Mind, the podcast where we aim to normalize conversations about mental health. Last season, we connected you with experts in the field of mental health to provide an understanding of topics and illnesses that may not have been easily accessible. This season, we will continue our learning journey together by not only speaking to experts, but also by listening to the voices and stories of real people who are living, surviving, and even thriving, while also facing challenges with their mental health in their everyday life. This season, we want to hear your stories to get the full truth of what it's like to manage one's mental health and navigate living with mental illness. I'm your host, Jayde, and on today's episode, we'll be exploring PTSD. First, I will sit down with therapist Cristina Mardirossian to go over what trauma is and how it leads to the development of PTSD. In the second part of the episode, I have a lovely conversation with Mia Hemstad, a mental health advocate, mother, and trauma survivor. Mia shares what led to her PTSD diagnosis, how it has affected her life, and the tools she uses to manage symptoms day to day. I hope by listening to the show, you're able to learn something new and gain some encouragement through hearing our experts and listening to the journeys of our guests. However, this show is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your mental health professional or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have about your condition. Never disregard professional advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on the Students of Mind podcast. This episode contains brief discussions about sexual abuse. If this is a topic that could be triggering or upsetting for you, I encourage you to skip to the time code listed in the top line of the description and refer to the show notes for resources that may be helpful for you. Today's first guest is Cristina Mardirossian, a marriage and family and certified EMDR therapist based in Pasadena, California. Cristina currently works predominantly with adult trauma survivors and individuals living with complex PTSD. In our conversation, we define trauma and dive into how it can develop into PTSD. Cristina also shares some of the modalities that she uses in her practice to help her patients heal from their trauma. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into the main topic of the episode, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So my name is Cristina Mardirossian, and I am the director and founder of Pasadena Trauma Therapy here in Pasadena, California. And it is a group practice. We specialize predominantly in working with trauma survivors, anyone on the trauma spectrum, but predominantly with sexual abuse survivors and dissociative disorders. We also run groups for sexual abuse survivors, both male and female. And I, on the side, also do a lot of workshops for mental health professionals on the topic of trauma that want to learn more about how to work with it in different modalities, which I'm happy to explain later. And I also provide consultations for therapists who want to learn more about how to work with trauma somatically or EMDR. So that's what I do. And I'm really excited to talk about PTSD with you here today.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing. I'm really excited for this conversation too. I feel like I know a little bit just because I have some family members with PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
but I am excited today because I know I'm going to learn some more.
Awesome.
So, like, just starting with the basics of, like, what is PTSD and what is the criteria for someone to be diagnosed with PTSD?
Good question. So I would like to actually talk about just the word trauma. And then I'm happy to explain the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. But I feel like trauma is on a spectrum. I feel like we are all on there to some degree. But essentially, I guess my definition of trauma is when we become traumatized, when our capacity to respond to a perceived threat is in some way overwhelmed, right? And so this impacts our ability to integrate the traumatic experience and accurately assess safety. So, like I said, trauma is on a spectrum. It could be a one-time incident, such as a car accident, a sexual assault, natural disaster, right? Death of a loved one, or something that is chronic and ongoing. So, for instance, someone who grows up in domestic violence as a child, or ongoing physical abuse and incest, right? So, ongoing. So, PTSD is a mental health condition. It stands for post traumatic stress disorder. And it occurs in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event. It can also come about from hearing about the trauma, just hearing about it. So, for example, someone hearing about the violent rape of a close family friend can feel traumatized after hearing something like that happen. So, PTSD affects approximately 3.5% of US adults every year, and an estimated 1 in 11 people, that's a lot, 1 in 11 people will be diagnosed with PTSD in their lifetime. Jayde, this might not shock you, but women are twice as likely as men to have PTSD. And the three ethnic groups, Latinos, African Americans, and American Indians, are disproportionately affected and have higher rates of PTSD in retrospect. In order to meet the PTSD criteria, PTSD symptoms may start within 1 month of a traumatic event, but sometimes they may not appear until years after the event. A lot of people don't know about that, but it can come about much later. And these symptoms cause significant problems in functioning in social or work situations and in relationships. So, according to the DSM, which is where therapists, it's our diagnostic manual where every diagnosis is written, PTSD has to have major type of symptoms. So, one of those is called re-experiencing symptoms. So, things like having flashbacks or intrusive thoughts about the trauma, what I call body memories. So, essentially, I'll give a quick example. It's if someone was sexually assaulted, right? And then months later they have pain in their vagina and they don't know why, right? And you rule out all medical causes and the pain is still there. That's a form of a body memory.
Mm.
Okay. So intense physical or emotional reactions to the reminder of the event is another way to re-experience. Nightmares is another way to re-experience the trauma, right? So that's the first category. The second category is called avoidance symptoms, which I think is very common, is when people don't want to talk about the trauma or they avoid people, places, or activities that remind them of the trauma, right? I had a client who was abused in a church. And so now whenever he drives by any church, right, his heartbeat increases, he gets sweaty, right? His body is telling him this is not safe. Even though logically, right, the trauma happened many years ago and he knows it's over, but his body is still giving him those re-experiencing symptoms that we just talked about. The third category is negative changes in your thinking and emotions. And so that could be anything like feeling down or depressed, anxious, right? Feeling shame or guilt is very common. Losing interest in the things you used to do. Being unable to remember important parts of the trauma, also very common. And just negative thoughts about yourself, other people, and the world. And the fourth category is what's called hyperarousal, or emotional or physical reactivity. So that could be anything like super hyper vigilant of your environment. Maybe it's hard to concentrate when you're in that state. Quick to anger or irritability. And then something that's not discussed very often, but in this category, I also have clients who do what's called high risky behaviors. So maybe impulsive sex or binge drinking, right? That creates this reactivity. So those are the four categories that you will find in the DSM about PTSD. And if I can put a little plug in for children, for kids, it can show up a little bit differently. You'll see things like wetting the bed after they've already learned to use the toilet, right? Like regressive behavior. That's a trauma reaction. Forgetting how or feeling unable to talk. So like selective mutism after a trauma. And kids will show us trauma in their play. So maybe they'll show you like violent scenes with their toys or some kind of abuse in their play activity. Frightening dreams is another way that kids will show that they're traumatized. And then being unusually clingy with the parent or adult. So these are some signs to also look out for in kids that have been traumatized.
Okay, so I guess my next question is, like, people experience trauma in different ways, as you mentioned. It's kind of a spectrum. So, like, if two people experience the same traumatic event, but only one person kind of has those, like, severe reactions, like, what's the difference? Like, what are there certain risk factors that make people more predisposed to having PTSD?
That's a great question. So, yeah, two people can go through the exact same trauma, and how they deal with it and manage it can be completely different. So, the risk factors is a great question. So, many factors play a part in whether a person will develop PTSD. Some of the factors that increase risk for PTSD, I'll name a couple things, is if they've lived already through dangerous events and traumas in their past, childhood trauma, right? When they're exposed to life-threatening events early on, feelings of horror, helplessness, or extreme fear add to that. Having no social support, that's really important. If they don't have anybody that they can talk to, a therapist, family, pastor, whoever, a friend, and they're stuck with it alone, that stays there, right? I think dealing with extra stress after the trauma can add as well a risk factor. For example, loss of a job or home. Having a history of mental illness or substance abuse can also increase the risks of having PTSD. But let me also speak to what can help promote recovery after trauma. As I mentioned, the social support is huge. Being able to talk about the trauma, being heard, right, being believed is a huge part of healing. Group therapy is really good for that, for trauma. And then getting back to one's life. So, returning to your routine, such as going to work or going to school to the best of your ability, right? Maintaining a sleep schedule. These things that are part of your normal day-to-day can help in terms of the risk factor. The one last thing I'll add to that list is making meaning of what happened. So I think when someone can make meaning in what happened with the trauma, right? What they think about themselves or people in the world after this trauma is really important, because that's how we can work through self-blame, and finding coping skills right after something like that has happened.
I feel like for a lot of the mental illnesses that are out there are like biological ways that it shows up. So I'm wondering how does it show up in the body?
Okay, so in the body and the brain?
Yeah, both, yeah.
Okay, so that's a really good question. So let's talk real basics about just certain parts of the brain that are really involved in PTSD. The amygdala is a part of our brain that is responsible for our flight, fight, or freeze response, right? It's the part of the brain that identifies some kind of threat, or if there's a danger around us. So this alarm system, we can call it, it prepares our body to respond either by dealing with or getting away from the threat or freezing. And so when somebody experiences a disturbing event, the amygdala sends a signal that causes a fear response. So those with PTSD tend to have an overactive amygdala, okay? The amygdala also communicates with other parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus, which releases stress hormone cortisol. Sorry, I don't want to make it too complicated, but one more part. The other important piece to mention is that our prefrontal cortex is the brain's area that assesses the source of the threat and determines if the body needs to stay on high alert to deal with the threat or if the body can calm down. So your prefrontal cortex helps you think through decisions. It observes how you're thinking and puts on the brakes when you realize something you first feared isn't actually a threat at all. So in other words, it helps us regulate emotional responses triggered by that amygdala, that fight, flight, or freeze. So people with PTSD, the prefrontal cortex doesn't always manage to do its job when it's needed because that amygdala is so overstimulated. So let me just simplify that. An overactive amygdala combined with an underactive prefrontal cortex, it's like the perfect storm, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is it kind of like the event kind of gets like stuck inside the brain in a way, and it can't tell that that's not a source of danger anymore?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's like the brain is scanning that hypervigilance we talked about earlier. It's like the brain is scanning to still assess danger. Another way I can simplify this a little bit is we have a left brain and a right brain, right? Our left brain is our logical part of the brain that can talk about the narrative of the trauma, whereas our right side, it's the opposite. It's body sensations, emotions, gestures, movement, unconscious stuff, and that's where a lot of the therapy has to come in. Talk therapy is really great, but it's limited. We have to access the other side.
So you mentioned talk therapy, which is, I think, a good segue into the next topic. Is like what are some of the treatments that are out there to treat PTSD or just trauma in general?
So talk therapies are really helpful in helping people navigate how they're reacting to frightening events that trigger their PTSD. And again, it's tapping into that left side of the brain. Talk therapy. It teaches us about trauma and its effects. We can help teach grounding techniques so that clients can have tools to regulate their nervous system. It can provide tips for better self-care, right, after a traumatic event, and it can change how people react to their PTSD symptoms. A very popular form of talk therapy is called cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on negative thoughts and emotions that are related to the trauma. So negative emotions like shame or guilt, and negative beliefs like I have failed or the world is dangerous, right? So the therapist would be able to help the client work through these thoughts and emotions. That is a left brain approach. There are other types of therapies that help with that right side of the brain. And I'm happy to explain some of those things. Trauma gets stored in the body. Okay, so let me give an example. I had a woman who was raped by a tall, bald Caucasian man. Even though she had talked, right, left brain, talked about that trauma for years in therapy, every time she would see a tall, bald Caucasian man, her right side would be overstimulated, right? Her heart would beat, she would get sweaty, her stomach would be in knots. It's as if the trauma was happening all over again, right? So talk therapy is going to help with, okay, let's differentiate how is this person different from your perpetrator, right? Is he the same height? Is he different weight? Does he dress differently? Is he a different age, right? That's called orienting to 2021, meaning name what's different now from the past. That's the left brain. But we need to address how it is still stuck in the brain, right? Because even though logically she knows she's safe, her right side of the brain is telling her she's not safe. So things like EMDR, brain spotting, havening techniques, these sensory motor psychotherapy, these are all somatic types of therapies that help tap into that right side of the brain. So EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. What it's doing, it's helping cross the material over from left to right brain through what's called bilateral stimulation. All bilateral stimulation means is the two parts of the brain. The easiest way to explain this is, when we're in REM sleep, our eyes are actually moving back and forth. And the purpose of that back and forth is to consolidate our memories. So it's no wonder people with PTSD have sleep issues, right? Their memories are not getting consolidated. So what EMDR does is it helps cross that material over to help consolidate our memories, make them whole, and feel like you can let it go. So how it works is the bilateral stimulation is either through eye movements that go back and forth. It could be through what they're called tappers that buzz in your hand back and forth, or tapping. So tapping can be on your shoulders. It could be on your knees that go back. So the point is back and forth, right? Bilateral. And so what the therapist would help you do is pick the memories that you want to address and activate you a little bit, right? They'll ask you, what image sticks out to you as the worst part of the trauma? What's the negative belief about yourself when you think of this trauma? What feelings come up with it, and where do you feel it in your body? Now that activates somebody a little bit, right? And once you have that information, that's when the therapist will apply the bilateral stimulation to help the brain work through it, not just by talking, but more somatically. So that's one modality. Another modality is called brain spotting. And brain spotting is really wonderful. The theory behind it is where you look impacts how you feel. So I'll give an example. I have a woman that when she speaks about her sexual abuse and she looks to her right, she goes into a freeze state. She can't move. She feels immobile. Same exact story. And she looks to her left, she goes into a rage state. So these are called brain spots, right? One is on this side, one is on this side. And so the therapist helps the client find this brain spot with a pointer. This is where it gets a little weird. With a pointer. And once you find where that freeze or fight flight response is, the therapist holds the pointer in that spot while the client just stares at it. And it helps release whatever memory is associated with that. Sometimes it's a sensation, sometimes it's feelings, sometimes it's images. It's a little bit similar to EMDR, just done differently. So that's brain spotting.
It's just so interesting to listen to this because I feel like at least even 5 years ago, when you look up PTSD, one, you only really see it as relating to veterans, and then two, talk therapy and medication seem to be what the treatment is that's suggested. So it's just really interesting to me hearing all of these unique, more hands-on ways of treatment. But at the same time, it also sounds like, from the patient's perspective and from experience, it feels like, these things bring a lot of stuff up and make the patients have to, go through them head on, which in a way I feel like is even more effective than just having a conversation about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
It is a lot of work, but I think if you, the audience who was listening to this, if you have a trauma, I really want to instill hope, because find a trauma therapist, not just a regular therapist. Find a trauma therapist, because a trauma therapist will have hopefully the education to lead you through the treatment in a way that doesn't have to completely mess you up. Can I tell you a little bit about how I view therapy?
Yeah, of course.
So I look at it in 3 stages. The first stage is what's called treating the symptoms. So what does that mean? That means that, let's say someone comes in and they have nightmares, they have flashbacks, they have body memories, right? I'm not going to throw them into processing trauma. The first step is, let's give you tools, right? Sometimes I'm not a big medication pusher, but sometimes medication is needed to help manage the intensity of the symptoms. But I first would want to try, let me just load you up with coping skills, right? Somatically as well. Once I can see that the client is able to use these skills and manage their symptoms better, then we can talk about phase 2, which is trauma processing. And some clients, they want to tell me every detail about their trauma, and that's perfectly fine. I will hear it, and some don't. And that's perfectly fine. No therapist should ever force you to talk about something if you do not want to. And the beauty of the modalities, the 2 at least that I described, I've done EMDR and brain spotting with people where I don't know anything. I know there's a trauma. I can figure out maybe what happened just given the symptoms, but they have never had to tell me their entire story, because you don't need to with EMDR and brain spotting. Okay? So don't feel like you have to talk about the trauma. There's many ways to process. And then the third phase is called integration into life. What does that mean? So once the client has worked through their trauma, what does that look like now? Right? So for my clientele, I'm working mainly with sexual abuse survivors. Well, if I've worked through my sexual abuse, what does this mean now in terms of sex? What does it mean in terms of intimacy, relationships, men or women, right? Whatever, whoever. What does this mean now, right? If I had social phobia because of my trauma, what does this mean now that I've done working on my trauma, right? So it's, how do I get back into the world safely, right? So this is how I look at trauma treatment. It's in these 3 stages, and there's no order. You can be in processing and go back to grounding. You can be in integration and go back to grounding, right? And trauma memories can come back even later after you've done the work, because of different life stages. What I mean by that is, I have had somebody who did the work, and when her perpetrator died, new memories came up and then came back into more work. I had somebody else where she did a lot of work, and then when she had a child that turned the age of when she was abused, came back and we did more work, right? So different stages of development are going to bring up stuff, and that's okay. It's workable. I just went on a long-winded spiel.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because I think therapy in itself, like trauma aside, is intimidating. And then someone who experiences trauma, the fear of even talking about it and thinking about talking about it to someone you don't know well, I feel like that can turn people off from therapy. So I think you kind of explaining the steps, and if someone's listening that's like wanting help but not sure, I think that could like ease a lot of anxieties around it. I also think you touched on the fact that therapy isn't always just like a linear kind of model. Like you can go up and down and side and all around, and that's normal. And yeah, I just think those are really important things to kind of reiterate for people. And that kind of, I thought of another question. Like what makes trauma therapists different than other therapists?
I would say the first thing that comes to my mind is that they realize that trauma is in the body. That has to be part of it. Talk therapy is not enough. It's not. Again, there's very good aspects of talk therapy, like CBT. Those things are needed in trauma therapy, but that alone is not going to do it. So if you're looking for a trauma therapist, just please make sure that they're trained in some capacity to work with how it shows up in the body.
Okay, so one more question kind of before we wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
Mental health as a whole, there's a lot of common misconceptions about what it looks like, how it's experienced. Um, for PTSD specifically, what are some of the common misconceptions that you come across or that your patients talk about experiencing?
Sure. So you actually named one of them already. So there's a myth that PTSD only impacts veterans, and that is just not true. It absolutely impacts veterans, but it can impact anyone who's experienced, witnessed, or has had secondhand exposure to trauma. So it's not just limited to veterans. The other big, I think, myth is that that if you have PTSD, the symptoms just show up immediately after an event, and that is not true. Symptoms can take up to months or years even for them to show up. I had somebody who her symptoms did not show up until she moved out of her childhood home because it wasn't safe for her stuff to show up. But once she got her own place, all of a sudden, all this anxiety and nightmares and flashbacks, started to appear because it was finally safe for this stuff to come out, right? The other myth is, not everyone who has a traumatic experience is going to have PTSD, right? Some will not. They may have trauma, they may have stress, but they're not going to have the full blown PTSD criteria. So I think that's important to note as well. And then this I see a lot in my clients. There's a myth that if you have PTSD, that you are a violent person. And that is just not true. I have never felt scared with any of my clients ever yet. That I'm sure that's possible at some point, but usually they're coming in because they're dealing with so much fear, right? But there's a common misconception that people with PTSD are violent or dangerous. I think those are the minority, and violence is not even included as part of a PTSD diagnosis. But I think what's important to note about this is that people can deal with their trauma and triggers in very different ways. And that reactive behavior typically comes from a place of fear and threat rather than a violent desire. Those people who are more violent and have PTSD are shown to be much higher in people who also have a substance abuse disorder. I think those are the main ones that come up to my mind right now.
Okay, and so just to finish up, I know you talked about, some of the things that you do outside of your practice. So how can myself and my audience stay up to date to all of those things you're doing and just any other work that you do?
Yeah, so they're welcome to check out my website. It's www.pasadenatraumatherapy.com. Or follow me on Instagram. It's Pasadena_trauma_therapy. Those are the two easiest ways. And the events for therapists are all listed on my website as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here and having this conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure people listening did too. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Our next guest is self-care coach, mental health advocate, and trauma survivor Mia Hemstad. In our conversation, you will hear about what led to Mia's diagnosis of PTSD and how she experiences and manages her symptoms. We also talk about what it's like being a mother while also living with mental illness. Welcome, Mia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jade. I'm so excited for this.
Yeah, me too. Before we get into the main topic of today, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work you do?
Awesome. Yeah. Well, my name is Mia. I live in Orange County right now, in California. It's south of LA. And I'm a mom. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. I'm married. I'm a communications manager by day for a nonprofit that fights for paid family leave policies, more equitable paid family leave policies. So social justice is really important to me. And I guess not even by night, but in whatever pockets of time I have, I run an Instagram account and a YouTube channel where I just raise awareness about mental health by sharing my own journey with PTSD and depression. And it started out by sharing my journey with postpartum depression and anxiety, because I thought that that was just the issue, like just postpartum, just like mental illness due to having children. But then that lifted, and then this whole other animal unearthed itself. So it's kind of an evolving channel that I just felt called to start 3 years ago, and 3.5 years ago now. Wow. And yeah, I get messages almost every day from people sharing how much it helps them. And it just makes me realize that there's so many people struggling, and we just don't talk about it. So I'm just grateful to be on your show today. And I'm grateful for the work you do, because even though it can feel lonely and hard sometimes being a content creator, I don't know if you feel that. It's just like, you're like, is anyone listening? But we are listening. People do. It does matter. What we do matters. So yeah, that's kind of what I do. And I also want to just caveat that I live in Orange County now, but I'm actually from Guam. I was born and raised in Guam. It's a small island that is very close to Japan and the Philippines. But my ethnicity is Mexican, German, and African Caribbean, with a little bit of Irish because of slave owner interference with my great 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 grandmother. So I started to include that in my intros with podcasts now, because I think it's a bigger part of my story than I realize. I've just been really working on figuring out where I belong. And I grew up in an island where I wasn't native, and everyone asked me where I was from. But as a small child, I thought, I'm from here. So working on my sense of belonging is a big part, I think, of my mental health journey, and a part of my depression and my anxiety of always feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. So I think it's important. And I wanted to bring it up because I think there are other people out there that know what it's like being a third culture kid, know what it's like, not really having a culture to identify with. And then society's like putting you in all these boxes. I think even just being multiracial in general is hard, even if you are very strongly connected to a culture. I think being multiracial, I think, brings a whole host of issues as well, when it comes to identity and when it comes to our mental health. So anyway, that's who I am in a nutshell.
Thank you for sharing so much. I think the, race and cultural part of your life and anyone's life is very important to any journey, but especially your mental health journey, and especially with the climate that we're in right now in the US. So I think I'm happy you share that, and I think it's important that people know that, other people are dealing with the same things, and, they're not alone. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. And I just realized this is a podcast, so people can't see my face,
Yeah.
and I'm like, just want people to know, I'm a mixed race kid over here, figuring it out, along with all of the rest of you mixed race kids.
Okay. So now let's kind of shift our focus. So this episode is specifically focused on PTSD. And I found you when I was kind of looking through YouTube about stories of people who live with PTSD. And your story stood out to me really because of the way you were able to be really clear with how you experience PTSD, and especially the way you experienced how it feels in your body. And I think that that's something a lot of people don't hear about often if they're not in spaces where mental health is talked about often. So I definitely wanted to have you here to share some of that. So my first question is just in general, like, when you were first diagnosed with PTSD, what were kind of the things leading up to it, and how was how was PTSD explained to you when you received that diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So leading up to it, I was in my first year. Wait, sorry, let me think about this. Yeah, my first year postpartum with my second child, and I was going through therapy for postpartum depression and anxiety. And it was in that setup that I was like learning more about past trauma, childhood trauma, and how that was affecting my ability to fully be the mom that I wanted to be. And I started to learn more about it, and it was being recommended to like get trauma therapy, but then wasn't really ever able to do that because one of the types of trauma therapy is EMDR therapy. It's basically a way of reprocessing old memories, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of work, and you need support. And I didn't have support at that time. You know, I am married, and maybe this is something other people relate to across the country, but especially in Southern California, people work so hard down here because it's so expensive to live here. And I know people are probably like, why don't you just move? And it's like, there's a whole host of reasons why I'm here. But anyway, basically I started to just become more aware of the fact that, oh, there's a lot more here. There's a lot more here than just postpartum. And I need to unpack it. And then so I basically was living with this increasing anxiety that was getting increasingly worse every day, every week, every month, to the point where I started to have immense amount of back pain, and it felt not like a muscle ache or a muscle pull, but like pins and needles. And if you read about it, it's fascinating how the nervous system actually will like shoot all these frequent electrical responses in your body because you are just shooting your body with cortisol when you're in that state of anxiety all the time. And it's not good for you, by the way. But that's why when you have anxiety, the pain isn't just like, oh, I pulled a muscle lifting a heavy weight or picking up my child. It's like, it's a very distinct pins and needles, tingling feeling that is uncomfortable. And it would happen pretty much every day as soon as my husband would leave for work. And so it's also very event centered. Like you'll feel the pain when there's a certain thing happening. And like, what does that represent to me? When my husband's gone, it means I'm on my own with 2 kids and a whole bunch of stuff going on in my heart and my mind that I don't know what to do with. And so there was that aspect. And then also the nightmares. So for me, nightmares is a regular occurrence in my life. There's probably about 9 days out of the month where my nightmares aren't as vivid, but for the rest of the time, it's basically like at night, my brain doesn't shut off. It doesn't rest. It doesn't get rejuvenated like other people. And yeah, it's really challenging. The nightmares are kind of a constant manifestation of the way that I felt throughout my childhood, just unsafe. And so I just continue to feel that at night. And apparently nightmares are one of the hallmarks of PTSD as well. And then because I was living under such intense sleep deprivation, then I started with the dissociation or derealization. So a disconnection from reality. So my brain can't handle all the stress and strain. So what your brain does is it just like decides to check out. So it's that feeling like when you're a kid and you're zoning out in space in class, you're just spacing out and everything gets blurry and you're kind of in your head. And it kind of is an enjoyable experience when you're a child. But as an adult, derealization is like, I zone out without wanting to, and I can't choose to zone back in. It's very helpless feeling. And that started to happen every day. It started to happen when I would drive with my kids in the car. And so then I stopped driving. So it's like this slow chipping away at any sort of normalcy, right? You're not sleeping. And when you're not sleeping, you're not exercising. When you're not exercising, you're not getting endorphins. And like you start not being able to leave the house. And it's just this horrible illness that just starts to take over. And it's slow. And I think even your loved ones don't see it. Like you really have to be talking about what you're going through. And it's another challenging thing I think with mental illness is because it's slow, we start to think it's normal. So, and so, yeah. And anyway, so I think I would have just kept dealing with it. But then then the sinusitis started happening. And sinusitis, for anyone who doesn't know, is when you get inflammation in your sinus cavities, which are in your forehead, your cheeks, your ears, your nose. And so basically your tissues will get inflamed. And there's a variety. People are like, oh, it's just allergens. But there's actually research being done that people who have anxiety also get sinusitis. And it's because inflammation can be caused by cortisol. Cortisol is caused by stress. And so the sinusitis got so bad, I could not breathe through my nose at all. And I would kind of have constant headaches because obviously we know what it feels like when we're congested, right? So it was just really slow. And it got to the point like I couldn't run after my kids. I couldn't play with them at the playground. Like I just became so sick. And the challenging part was I don't really have a support system here in Orange County. And so I wasn't really around friends who like, I guess I felt safe talking to about this stuff or whatever. And like, I know I would tell my husband and like, you know, he was like, yeah, like, let's have you go to therapy. It's just a really slow process of figuring it all out. I think that's one of the hardest things when you have mental illness. It just takes a long time. And then, yeah. So, and then I had a really traumatic event happen. I think it was September or October, where I was going to have to like be, in proximity to one of the people who really hurt me when I was a kid, who's connected to my trauma. And that really, I didn't anticipate what a reaction my body was going to have to that. So I started having panic attacks, and then I started to have serious suicidal ideation. So then all of a sudden, my brain is constantly fantasizing about death and wanting to die. And I think, again, it's just our brain just being like, I'm done. I can't do it anymore, you know? And it was really scary. You know, they were unwanted thoughts. You know, I want to be here. I have a lot of dreams and plans for my life. And I have children and a husband that I love. And it was a very, really rickety time. So this is all in 2019. And then I finally, I was very scared to take medication. Like, I didn't think I was the kind of person that needed it. And then I, thank God, heard a podcast of a woman who I really admired said she takes medication every day to function. And I was like in shock. I'm honestly shocked, and I'm appalled that how many people are taking medication every day and they just don't talk about it. And it's not anyone's job, but I really don't think I would have gotten on medication without that. Like without that, like that story of someone being like, yeah, I take it every day. I'm a mom. I run a podcast. I do, you know, I was just so impressed. And she had her sister on, and her sister was also talking about how she takes medication every day. And I can't tell you, Jayde, like that changed my life. Like I could cry. Mm-hmm. Like I was my 4th wedding anniversary. My husband and I went on our first getaway ever from our children. Like, we didn't have a honeymoon. And the whole time I was there, I was struggling with suicidal ideation. Like I couldn't enjoy it. Like I felt horrible. And so then that really pushed me to go and find a psychiatrist I trusted. I got clinically evaluated. I checked all the boxes for PTSD, and it was explained to me, you know, we think it's only people who go to war, but it's just anyone who lives with this trauma that's physically and mentally debilitating. And for these reasons, right, chronic nightmares, et cetera, disassociation, disconnecting yourself from reality. That's another hallmark of PTSD. And then I started on medication. I started on a pediatric level dose, which is a child level dose of medication. And I was really lucky that I started to feel the effects of the medication within 2 weeks. Usually it takes 4 to 6 weeks, depending. And sometimes when people start medication, it doesn't work for them and they have to switch meds a lot of times. Like I heard one woman say that it took her 13 different meds to find the one that works for her. So it takes a lot of patience, and it's a very challenging process. And I was very lucky. And I remember the day I woke up and I didn't, like, the suicidal ideation was gone. And I just felt like a completely different person, and it honestly saved my life. And then this year, which is a new development in my story, I haven't really shared publicly until now. I actually just got off of that medication about 6 or 8 weeks ago. I kind of grew out of it. And that can happen sometimes. People don't talk about that either, where you grow out of it or you grow out of the dose and then they want to up your dose. And so I started to up my dose, and upping my dose wasn't working. And so the next recommendation was that I try a different medication. And I'm at a point in my journey where I'm finally in trauma therapy. I'm doing EMDR therapy every week. I'm lucky enough to have really great health insurance through my job, which is just a whole nother thing I could just get angry about, that I had to have a job that had good health insurance in order to get trauma therapy, right? It's just anyone should be able to get this healing. But yeah, so now I really want to just, I want to let my brain heal. And this is such a great opportunity because I have trauma therapy. I can afford weekly therapy. And my husband doesn't have a job right now. So he's home every single day because of the pandemic. So he's home every day. So if I'm having a particularly rough day, I can have a rough day. Whereas when I was a mom on my own with my children, I couldn't afford to have a rough day. Like, who's going to feed these kids? Who's going to change their diapers? Who's going to take them to the playground? Who's going to bathe them and feed them? I couldn't afford to have a rough day. And that's what's so devastating, is like living with mental illness is like means you have a pretty much, because I track my cycle, 20 out of the 30 days of the month, I'm having really rough days, really like challenging time. And that is partly because I'm not on medication anymore. I'm like totally opening up the floodgates, right? And I'm living through it. And I just pushing through with the hope that I will keep moving through the other side of all of this, right? But yeah, so that's like the whole journey in a nutshell from 2019 until now. And man, it can feel lonely sometimes. I'm going to be honest. But I know I'm not alone. I think that's part of why I create. It's part of why I show up on Instagram and I share some things, and I try to give hope and inspiration, and also teach what I know, because I have been on a very active healing journey for the last 7 years. When I woke up 7 years ago and kind of realized, wow, I actually went through a lot of trauma and I need to acknowledge this. And that started 7 years ago. And it's been a long journey since then.
Yeah, I think that's something I noticed as you were going through your story, is how active you have been during your journey. And I think there's a lot of people who which is kind of my experience, where you get a diagnosis of sorts, but you're not really active in it. You're kind of just floating along
Yeah.
the process of it. Something interesting that stood out to me was your experience with medication, and how like hearing that podcast kind of made you realize the benefits of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's so many different experiences when it comes to psychiatric meds. Like for me, I've been on meds for anxiety and depression since I was 12.
Wow.
And my opinions on it are on both sides of the spectrum, but I'm also very aware of how much it allows me to be able to get through a day.
Yeah.
And that's something that I feel like people sometimes don't understand. And psychiatric meds get a really bad rap. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I have like an episode planned to kind of dive deeper into that. But it was interesting to hear kind of your experience with that. And meds work so different for everyone.
Yeah.
And I'm also like one of the people where it's like they'll work for a certain amount of time, and then the effects won't be as strong, and then I'll have to switch.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that was also important to mention, that just the journey, even if you have a mental illness, that's the same diagnosis as someone else, it's going to look different and
Absolutely.
react different to treatment.
Yeah. I mean, you know what I really would have loved when I was in the depths of that trauma and my body was remembering so much last year because of the traumatic event? I would have loved to go to some sort of intensive care unit, like for psychiatric care, to just like have some intensive trauma therapy. Who can afford that? you know, who can afford to go do that and leave their kids, right, with somebody else? It's just, there's so many different paths. And, medication, when I upped my dose this year, because I did try the upping the dose, I got acne, and it might not seem like a big deal considering this medication saved my life. And, I don't care that I have acne. I'm glad I'm alive. But, you know, it's like you have to weigh out the pros and cons for you. I wasn't getting that many benefits from the medication anymore. I was getting like a lot of acne, and it's been weeks, so I'm healed from it, but I've never had acne. And so it was like actually really hard for me. Like it's kind of changed how I look at myself and how I show up for my day. And it sounds silly, but um I think it's just important to constantly weigh the pros and cons and also evaluate what you can afford, because last year, all I could afford was medication. Like medication is affordable, you know, going to trauma therapy isn't. And so, you know, it's just you do the best you can with the time and energy and resources you have. It's like one of my mantras I repeat it all the time. And to myself and to my clients, because I think we get stuck on, well, I wish I could do this thing. I know this might help me. And it's like, girl, but can you afford to do that right now? You know, and it's like, don't give up on yourself because you have this ideal of what your treatment should look like. Just keep fighting for your life and whatever that looks like. And that's the thing. It's like, you got to surround yourself with people who understand what that's like, because I swear, like 20 days out of the month, I feel like I'm fighting for my life, but I don't look like it. And it's very hard to be in that space. And I think you know, for me personally, I need a lot of validation. Like I need people to be like, oh, wow, I really see like you're fighting for your life. It's totally okay if you need to like take it slow today. I had to learn and have to learn to keep being that person that validates my own struggle. Like I have to just be the one that's like, Mia, you know your body, you're struggling today. Here's how we're going to approach it. And I just think it's so important for those of us with mental illness. We could get so exhausted trying to explain ourselves to other people and trying to get people to honor our struggle and to get it. And let me just tell you, you're living with mental illness, you don't have energy for that. Spend that energy honoring your own struggle and honoring it, not just by respecting what you're going through, but meeting yourself where you're at by trying your very best to get yourself the support and tools that you need. And there was a time when all I could afford was a $15 book by Brene Brown to read about mental health and rising through your trauma. And now I can afford to go to trauma therapy every week, you know, and I don't take that for granted, but you really got to just keep fighting. You got to keep meeting yourself where you're at.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's such like a certain image in people's mind of what mental health treatment looks like. But even something I've learned in the past like 2 years is that, you know, treatment and healing are two different things. And, you know, you can get some healing in the westernized form of treatment, but the real healing comes with like looking and feeling how you are and seeing where you are and figuring out what things work specifically for you. And I think that's hard. That's
It's
not
really
easy.
hard. That's what I'm going through
And
now. Like going through
yeah.
trauma therapy, I'm telling my I go through half a box of tissues every freaking session. And I was telling her, like, I feel like I thought I got through all this and now I feel all these things again. And she was like, you know, as kindly as she could, she was just like, you got to a place where you could function alongside those things, all that baggage, right? Medication helps us to do that, helps us function alongside the baggage. But now you're not on medication. And now all this stuff that you lived alongside is now taking front and center stage and you have to face it. And now we're facing it. And she told me, you feel raw and kind of overwhelmed because we just went through trauma therapy. She's like, but you have to normalize this. This isn't something to be scared of. This isn't something to run away from. This means that you're doing the work and you're opening up the wounds and you're addressing them and you're moving through them, because suppression, and like, let me be clear, I think there was a time in my life where if I opened that can of worms, it would have sent me over the edge. Like I pretty much did. Like I was suicidal last year. But I'm at a place now where I have the support system and I have the therapist where I can open the can of worms safely. Right. So like, I'm definitely not saying like, oh, you know, don't smoke that weed or like, don't take those drugs, you know. This sounds terrible. It's like, Mia's for drugs. It's like, no, Mia just wants you to stay on board. And I want you to do whatever you need to do to stay on board. But stay on board. Don't like black out and numb yourself to the point that you're not even really on board either, right? We don't want to swing too far on the pendulum. What I am trying to say though is like, now I'm at the phase of my healing journey where I'm not just trying to survive, I'm trying to heal. And it feels like I'm failing because I feel like crap most of the time. But my therapist helped remind me, like, but this means that you're being brave and you're going back and you're reprocessing, and that takes so much energy. And so I'm just normalizing feeling like crap. Like, I'm normalizing it, and I'm like not letting it make me have a crap day. And so what that means is, for instance, this morning I still managed to go out to a park with my kids and enjoy that beautiful Southern California sun that we have down here, and the blue skies. And like, my husband went to Whole Foods and grabbed some stuff for us to eat. And, would I have loved to go and do like a massive LA hike? Yes, but I don't have energy for that. I do what I can do. I live my life as much as I can live it. And I might spend the rest of this day on the couch, but that's okay. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm healing, and just, I think we got to embrace that messiness of healing. We got to embrace it.
Yeah, I agree. And something you said a little earlier was how, like, you can't see a lot of these things on the outside. Like, if it was more of a, like, physical illness, like
Mm-hmm.
diabetes or cancer or something, people definitely get a hell of a lot more sympathy for things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But as go through your day living with something that's invisible, and that validation, like, I agree with you. Like, it's so hard to feel validated in your struggle
Mm-hmm.
when you can't show outwardly all the time that you are in that struggle.
Yeah.
Um, and finding that self-validation is really important, but also really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
something I like about how you're talking about your journey is, like, you're constantly saying, like, being in a struggle, like, 90% of the month, it sucks, but that's the way that you're gonna get to feeling great
Mm-hmm.
90% of
Mm-hmm.
the week. Like, it's not the end of the world. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean your life as a whole is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
It just means right now you're doing the nitty-gritty of the work that you need to do so you can thrive even more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, one of the things that, because let me be honest with you, my therapist laughs at me because she will not say that we're going to do EMDR therapy. I have to say we're going to do it. And I've gone through weeks where I said we're going to do it, and I end up spending the whole session just talking. And it's because I'm avoiding it. And so after a long break, we came back and we've done 2 sessions in a row, 2 whole sessions in a row. And yeah, so like, it's not easy, and it feels like something I want to run away from. But what motivates me is the hope that I will move through some of this baggage that I know is holding me back in my life. Like, no, a lot of people think it just are like, let's just muscle through mental illness, right? But what is mental illness taking away from you? Like, what is untreated mental illness taking away from you? Unhealed trauma taking away from you? And I remember being at a conference for mental health, and this psychiatrist was saying people always talk about the side effects that come with psychiatric drugs, but they don't talk about the side effects from untreated mental illness. The wear and tear on your nervous system, the wear and tear on your energy, on your body, the constant cortisol, the poor sleep, and what that does to longevity when you're not sleeping well, right? It's like, we just think, oh, but this label says this might happen to me. And it's just like, I really encourage people to challenge that and to wake up and realize that mental illness is an illness. The same way that you would go get treatment for diabetes or the flu, you should get treatment for your mental illness, because it is doing stuff to your body. And I don't say that to scare people. I say that to hopefully spare some people any more years of unnecessarily suffering. Every time I've done something for my mental health, I always am like, I go through this period of like, why the heck didn't I just do this 2 years ago? You know what I'm saying? And then I got to like have some self-compassion and realize, well, because I never have had anyone in my family ever talk about mental illness or mental health or get treatment for it. I've never seen anyone get treatment. As far as I know, I'm the only one. And when I talk about it, I'm pretty sure most of my family thinks I'm crazy. And that's perfectly fine, because you know what? At the end of the day, they don't have to wake up and live with this. I do. And so if I'm going to live my life, I need to be responsible for my life. And that means being responsible for my treatment. But another thing that motivates me that I wanted to share with everyone is back in the day when I had zero money, I went to a free support group, and I was sitting at a table with people in their 50s and 60s and even 70s who were just debilitated, who you could see the pain of trauma and mental illness had been wearing on their brains and bodies for decades. I mean, people were at the table who just unearthed the fact that they were sexually assaulted in their childhood, multiple people, and they didn't really acknowledge it until they were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I'm 26, and people think I'm in my mid 30s, which they get really embarrassed because like they're like, oh my gosh, it wasn't because of how you looked. And it's like, I'm like, I know I look really tired. It's fine. But they're like, you're just so wise. And it's just like, because I've lived through too much. So I don't also feel like that's a compliment, because it's like, I would rather have just had a childhood, but it's okay. Anyway, sorry, getting distracted. But I'm sitting at this table, right? And I'm just like, wow, I'm so blessed. I'm so lucky that here I am at that time, I was like 23, 24, acknowledging all the horrible things that happened to me. And I have this opportunity to start my healing now rather than starting it when I'm older. And I just want anyone who's listening to this who is older, like, never, ever, ever, ever compare your journey to anybody else's. Like, I just hope that you can hear this and go, okay, enough. I'm going to start taking care of myself right now, because life is so short, especially as we've seen this year. Life can change in an instant. And yeah, even if I might, sounds morbid, but like die before I really feel a lot of healing, at least I know I tried. At least I know I stopped abandoning myself. I stopped neglecting myself, and I started to take care of myself. And so, yeah, I just have to really tap into those things every day to keep me going, that like I'm lucky and I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, and I think that's the blessing of the age of media and social media right now is young people get exposed to people who are struggling, and they're like, oh, they can relate and they can
Yes.
start this work early.
Exactly. We're so lucky because our parents' generation and their generation before them, you weren't allowed to talk about mental illness. And if you do research, if you had any semblance of a mental illness, you were checked into a psychiatric institute and done God knows what to. So it was like a life or death legitimate fear. Like, we're so lucky now that it's becoming normalized to talk about it. Therapy is becoming more accessible. You can go to therapy on your computer. That wasn't even an option before this pandemic for a lot of people. So we're just so lucky. And I just try to remember that and not just to help me keep going.
Yeah, that's definitely something I remind myself of too. And that's just kind of like makes all of this work like more exciting and motivates me more, because
Yes.
I know even though there's a lot of stuff out there encouraging people to get the help, there can never be too much.
No, there can't, and I see more people popping up being like, oh, I'm going to start like a YouTube channel about mental health. And I'm like, good for you. I'm so happy because, everyone's going to resonate differently. Like, everyone has a different journey. Everyone's got different experiences, and there can never be too many people. You're right.
And kind of speaking to that, I know you talked about some of the treatment that you are doing for PTSD, but I was wondering kind of more of the like personal and like specific things that you do for your healing to help manage your PTSD symptoms, because like we were talking about, it's a very individual journey.
Yeah. I guess this is kind of like talking about the day-to-day, right? Like kind of like how I survive. Okay. I have ritualized my self-care. And when I say ritualize, it means it's not just something I do every once in a while. It is like biblical. It is like non-negotiable, right? I figured out how to have a consistent self-care routine. And I have a couple of, so rolling it back, basically it's really basic. It's like, I make sure I brush and floss my teeth and wash my face and moisturize it every night. That took me my whole life to figure out how to do that. It was really hard for me to do those things. And I used to be super ashamed to say that there were years I didn't brush my teeth at night. But then I was talking to some other people with mental illness, and they said they struggled with the same thing. So you're not alone if you struggle with that. Picking up that toothbrush just seems overwhelming. That was actually the cornerstone habit. I made that a goal for like my New Year's resolution. It was like brush my teeth every night in like 2017. And when I say cornerstone habit, it means once you get one thing down, it starts to create a ripple effect in your life. You start to build momentum. So you have to figure out why it's so hard to build that habit, and then do whatever you can to make it easier. So for me, it was buying my very first electric toothbrush in my whole life. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I don't spend more than $2 on a toothbrush, right, at Walmart. And I'm buying this expensive toothbrush. So I got a Quip toothbrush. And what really resonated with me was that it buzzes when it's time to switch to a different quadrant. And then it turns off after 2 minutes. And so I honestly think I had undiagnosed OCD. It's definitely much better now, but I would brush my teeth for like 15 minutes. And it was really bad for my gums. It caused gum erosion. So I definitely probably had some OCD back in the day. And so I really was like, wow, this toothbrush is going to turn off and tell me when it's done. And I also would get anxiety about my toothbrush, like going past 3 months and forgetting to replace it. But Quip like sends you a new brush head, and I can't believe I'm giving them all this free advertising because they're not paying me to do any of this stuff. Quip, sponsor me. But I'm telling you, that was a game changer for me. I started to brush my teeth every night. And then after like several months of doing that successfully, then I started to add in flossing every night. And it sounds so simple. I probably spent half of 2017 building just one habit. But then this one habit led to now washing my face every night and moisturizing it. And that made me feel so loved and cared for. And then that led to me making my bed every morning. And that just became another cornerstone for my day. And then exercise. Like, exercise cannot be negotiable. Every person needs to be exercising. And if you have chronic pain like me, where your back is always tingling and hurting, then do what I did when I had really bad chronic pain, which was 10 minutes of just gentle stretching in the morning. It was like, okay, I can't do the 30-minute HIIT workouts I used to do back in the day, but what can I do? Every day, it's like, what can I do? And it's just like, I will move hell or high water to exercise. It has to happen. It's like the endorphins, like, and whenever it got hard, I would just think, okay, well, I don't have 20 minutes, but I can do 10. And if I don't have 10, then I'll do 5. But why can't we honor our bodies? Like, why do we just use our bodies like machines to go, 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 push, 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 more emails, more writing, more work? And it's like, when are you going to stop and give back to your body that you're working like a horse, And so to me, it's just so important to work that in. And so there's just so many little things to do throughout the day. And I don't do all of them perfectly. Like when I'm having a really hard time and I'm not sleeping well, like I might peel it all back to like the most basic things. Cause there's other things I like to do, like make sure I eat healthy and drink water. But it's just like you do what you can, but I have this arsenal of tools that I know help me feel better. And so when I'm feeling super lost in my head, I'm like, okay, I know I should probably exercise, or like, I know I should take a shower. Or there was a season in the beginning of the pandemic where I took a bath like almost every other night, and I bought myself some Epsom salts. And it's because I didn't have the energy to shower. It's like hard to shower when you're depressed. And so, and it's being a Black person and having dry skin, like you got to lotion your whole dang body every time you shower. It's so much work. And so, especially when you have sinusitis and you can't breathe, it's like I'm out of breath. And so I started to do this thing where I would put jojoba oil in my bath. And when you get out, you're moisturized. It's like the most incredible thing. So I have all these hacks for when I'm really depressed and I can't, and like, even like when I'm really depressed, I don't want to shower. I don't want to brush my teeth. But I'm like, it's only going to take 2 minutes. It's only going to be 120 seconds. You've got this. And even if your teeth don't feel perfectly clean, because ideally I actually like to brush my teeth for 5 minutes, but it's like, but 2 minutes is better than nothing. I really have to coach myself like through every activity of the day. And it's a lot, but it gets me through and it keeps me healthy. And I would so much rather be doing these things to cope than other things. Like I used to bite my nails. I used to pick my skin a lot. And what else? Addiction to my phone, like just completely escape reality and be on my phone. So yeah, I just try to have my arsenal of tools. And so I just want to encourage everyone listening, like figure out what that cornerstone thing is for you. Like what's that one thing that you need to do? Is it like brushing your teeth? Do you need a different toothbrush that makes you excited to brush your teeth? Is it like taking a bath? Like, do you need to get a big bag of Epsom salts from Target and just keep it by your bathtub so that you know, oh yeah, that reminded me, I'm going to just sit in some hot water right now. And honestly, it starts to get fun. I'm honestly very proud of myself for developing all these rituals that I do. And I mean, this could be a whole other podcast episode, but what those rituals have done for my self-worth is incredible. Like, I mean, after going through so much neglect and abuse and now being an adult and realizing that I can treat myself with so much care and love is truly life-changing. Like, it's changed so much for me, and it's like so validating to honor your struggle through a hot bath or through some delicious tea, and to like write it down and put it on your grocery list, or like buy yourself your own flowers for yourself to honor, like the same way, like if someone you love was sick and you'd bring them flowers, like write, go write yourself a nice note, get well soon, no, buy yourself some flowers. And it really is so impactful for your self-worth. It starts to change the narrative, because if you were raised to believe that you're nothing but a burden and you were neglected, you weren't cared for the way you needed, and then you start taking ownership of how you treat yourself, you realize, oh wait, I'm an adult now and I get to choose how I live my life and how I treat myself. And so it's very empowering. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, that's definitely, I feel like when you get into adulthood and you're even just physically away from your parents,
Mm-hmm.
even if they weren't, the best, and you did experience neglect as a child, it's kind of like, whoa, like where am I supposed to get that love and support
Mm-hmm.
from? And finding it within yourself, something I struggle with, which I feel like
It's
is
hard.
something a lot of people struggle with. It's
Yeah.
really hard, is like so key, because on the days where I do spend extra time on self-care and, make it a point to care for myself, I feel better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really important for people to know as well.
Yes, I love
Mhm.
that. And, yeah, it is hard. There are definitely days. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram, if you've taken the test, but
Mhm.
I'm an Enneagram 3, and that just means like I'm an
Okay.
achiever, and I used to be a horrendous workaholic. And so I still have these tendencies where it's like you just spent 30 extra minutes on your makeup when you could have did 30 extra minutes of work, you could have gotten ahead. Like I still have those voices, but I've built up enough evidence now from ritualizing self-care that I'm like, shut up. I'm like, be quiet, brain. You're going to thank me later. And I know that it's going to help me. Like, I know. And even if it doesn't, because we often see on social media, it's like when you take care of yourself, like you're going to be more productive, and it's going to make your work even better. And sometimes I take care of myself and my work isn't better. And I take care of myself and I'm not more efficient because I had no sleep for the last 7 days because of nightmares. Self-care doesn't always have to be about improving and boosting the quality of your work and everything else in your life. It's just affirming your humanity. It's affirming what you need, and it can just be for those reasons. Like, and I think also like that's why so many people, like, we get into maybe relationships we don't really want to, or we get into commitments we don't really need, because we leave our parents and then we wonder, oh wait, who's supposed to nurture me now? And then be like, oh, I need a boyfriend, or I need a girlfriend, I need a relationship, I need someone in my life that's nurturing me. And it's like, that's not a safe place to be entering into relationships from. You want to enter a relationship as a whole person, and part of how you do that is by nurturing yourself. You are capable of nurturing yourself, and that's challenging because then we have to learn to like ourselves, and we have to learn to enjoy our own company. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I liked how you talked about, self-care doesn't always help you feel productive,
Mhm.
but something I remind myself of is that self-care is productive,
Yes.
and yeah, that's something that I constantly remind myself of because it's productive and self-care takes work. Like,
Yes.
it takes work to get yourself to get in that bath or to take the time to brush
Mhm.
your teeth.
Mhm.
It's not easy, and reminding yourself of that at the end, you're like, "Oh, I did that. That was productive."
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's what I
Exactly.
remind myself of.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
think about like, I mean, this might be a no-brainer for some people who make their bed every day, but there was a while I'm like, why am I gonna make my bed when I'm just gonna get back in my bed, right?
Me
Because
too.
yeah, it's like because we take care of things that we have. That's just important. You just take care of what you have. Things will last longer when you take care of what you have, including you. Including your skin and your teeth and your body, you'll last longer. You'll feel better
Yeah.
about yourself. So, yeah, but it does take work. And especially as a mom, I had to work through a whole nother layer of you shouldn't do this. You're a bad mom. You should be spending this time with your kids. You haven't practiced your sight words with your son, and realizing like how I'm a mom, but I'm still allowed to have Mia time. Where did I get this idea that I needed to be with my children 110% of the time? I'll tell you where. Instagram moms unfollowed all those people. And I realized I want to define motherhood for me. And for me, that still means that I have a life outside of my children. Every day I have time where I do things for myself. And so, yeah, it can be hard for people who are caregivers or parents also for those reasons.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into my next question. It's just, what is it like being a mom and living with PTSD, but also just mental illness in general? I feel like among all of the parts of your story that are unique, you are a young mom. And I know that there's a lot to come that comes with that. So, like in our last few minutes, I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit about what that experience has been like.
Well, thanks for asking that question. I think you might be the first person who's asked that question.
Oh,
Yeah, you think more people would ask that because
yeah,
it is an added element, and it's lonely because a lot of people who are young today are not married and they don't have kids. And I do not shame them for that because it is hard. And so, do what you feel is, your calling. But it also means there's not a lot of people to talk to about what I'm going through, who understand it. So I would say I have a lot of guilt that I'm currently working through, especially with my first child, because I was very much deep in my healing journey when I had him. And then on top of that, I became a caregiver for my brother out of nowhere. And it wasn't really an option. He was really sick. And so all of a sudden I have my baby boy, and then I'm caregiving and I'm struggling with unknown mental illness that I hadn't diagnosed yet, right? So I would say that it's challenging, and that the most important thing that you can do is get validation for what you feel, get support for any current mental challenges you're going through, and also learn to practice self compassion. So, self compassion is something that I wasn't really aware of until I read this book called Radical Acceptance by Dr. Tara Brach. And I can't believe I never learned about self compassion before this, but now it's something I invoke every single day. It's just basically meeting yourself where you're at and saying, it's understandable why you feel this way. It's understandable why you struggled with your temper in those early days. You weren't getting any sleep and you were being asked to do way too much and you had no support system. Let's forgive ourselves and keep moving forward. And I'm really just working on that, and also working on not fixating on the past, but learning to keep making the most of the present. And, one of the things is like my son really loves being with me. And I noticed that because I have all this guilt about how I feel like I failed him in his first 2 years of life, I noticed I didn't want to play with him. Like I didn't want to be with him because, we all have that feeling where we feel ashamed and we don't want to like be around the person that we feel ashamed, like that we hurt or something, even though I didn't hurt him, but I also had these insane ideals at the time as well. I was running in the wrong circles, hanging out in mom groups with moms who were practically competing with each other for perfectionism. And so that also didn't help. And so I really am looking back and like having to meet that past version of me with compassion and say, like, I really was doing the best I can with what I knew at the time. And I have been actively working on myself. And today I spent some time with him. We had a picnic outside and he was like, Mommy, what did he say? I love you all day. That's how his way of saying, I love you very much. I love you all day, Mom. And I'm so excited you're here. I'm so excited to be with
Oh my
you.
God,
Yeah.
it's precious.
It's so precious. And I'm going to be honest, like when he would say that to me before, I would feel even more ashamed. Like this precious boy deserves so much better than me. Right. But there's this mantra that one of my therapists told me that I have to keep invoking, because you can tell that my motherhood and mental illness is still very much something I'm navigating. And it's, you're the best mom for your kids and they're the best children for you. Like you were made for each other. And I'm enough for him. He sees me as enough. What's getting in the way of our relationship is me not thinking I'm enough. So it's a very much an active thing. And I'm realizing that now that I've ritualized my self-care and I've taken care of myself and I've got that down, I need to start ritualizing certain practices in my motherhood that help me to feel connected to my children and to my purpose as a mother as well. And so that means probably like having every other Saturday is like only time with this child. And I do this thing and it's like we do an activity that we love to do together. And it doesn't have to be that big of a deal. It could even just be like you just make sure that on Saturday mornings you're reading a story together. But it's really ritualizing it, because otherwise, my mental illness will run the show. Like it will make me go on my phone or ignore, and I have to schedule it in and make it non-negotiable in order to keep building those neuron connections that it's safe to be here with my son. It's safe to sit down and play. I never experienced that as a child, so I think that's why I avoid it, because to me, mothers are just supposed to sacrifice and slave away and work and cook and clean. And so I feel like I'm a mom when I'm doing that, but now I need to teach myself that I being a mom can also be having picnics with your kid on a Saturday morning. So yeah, I'm really just trying to redefine and rebuild that from scratch, right? And that's the thing that's hard, I think, for those of us who didn't have that stuff modeled to us, is generationally, we have no blueprint and we got to create all this stuff from scratch, and acknowledging that takes a lot of time and energy. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
Thank you so much for sharing. I feel like that's, especially when you're in the thick of it, that's very vulnerable. So I really appreciate it. And I feel like I'm not even a mom, but like I feel like that, just imagining myself in the future, hearing that helps me. And I feel like that hearing that will help a lot of people.
I hope so, because one of the things I hear from people is like, they're like, I'm so broken. How could I possibly have a child? And it's like, I mean, definitely be working on your healing, but know that you'll probably have brokenness for your whole life. None of us are getting it through this life unscathed. Brokenness is normal. And I want my kids to know that mommy struggles with stuff. I actually, for the very first time in my son's life, he's 4, I had to explain to him my mental illness. I thought it was going to be when he's 8, but I actually needed to explain it to him now. And he understood, honestly, way more than you realize. Kids are so smart, and it just makes him more empathetic with me when he asked me to play for the 6th time, and I'm like, I just really can't today, bud. Like, here's what I can do with you. I can read to you on the couch, or we could watch a show together, but I just can't sit on the floor. My body's hurting, or I haven't gotten sleep. And he understands because he knows mommy struggles with, X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I think I just want all the people out there who are dreaming one day of having a family, like, don't wait till you're perfect. Like, it's never gonna come. So yeah, I just have the right support around you. I think friendship and people who have the similar struggles is really important.
Yeah, and I think, again, touching on support and having the same struggles, hearing stories like you, since, young people are on the internet so much, the fact that your story is here is very helpful as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you organizing this and creating this show. I know it's a lot of work and it's a commitment, and I just wish you much success and prosperity in your work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So before we go, How can myself and my audience continue to support you and hear more about your story and follow what you're doing?
Well, thank you for asking that. I really appreciate it. So, I have a YouTube channel that hasn't been posted on, but I will get something out there soon. I made this awesome like self-care inspiration video where I start to share some of my self-care rituals with you all. So go to my YouTube channel. It's Mia Hemstad. Subscribe there. I post on Instagram almost every day. I'm sharing self-care stuff, and I'm also talking about racism, of course, because of what's going on and being part Black. It's very important to me. So know that you'll get a little bit of both there. And I also, I can't believe I already forgot this. I've been working so hard on this, and I finally been taking a break, but I launched my virtual support group. It's called No Longer Last. And it's a support group where I basically teach you how to make yourself a priority. And it's particularly for women because I think we've been conditioned as a society to be the constant caregivers, homemakers, and martyrs in our homes. And I want people to stop doing that by taking care of themselves every day. And there's all these tools to support you in that program. I have a workshop, and I have some other resources like a guided journal and like some journaling prompts to help you work through just a whole lot of issues and baggage as to why it's so hard for you to take care of yourself. So you can go to miahemstad.com to check that out. It's something I'm really proud of. And we're actually doing our first support group meeting of the quarter tomorrow. So yeah, it's we have a monthly support group meeting as well. So if you don't have friends that understand what you're going through, there are spaces on the internet where there are people who share. And one of the things I love about my group is that several of the women in there are very open and honest about the mental illnesses they have. And so it's just very relieving, because sometimes we have no energy to validate ourselves. Sometimes I don't have any energy, and I can go in this group and be like, I've been having the hardest time. And then all these women are like, I'm right there with you. This has been a really hard week. Like it's going to be okay. And I think that's just such a beautiful thing that we forget that we need as humans. I think we don't really put as much value on it, but I think seeking out community, especially during this pandemic, is just so vital to our mental health. Anyway, but yeah, thanks for asking. Those are all the ways you can connect with me and stay in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. You were so easy to talk to. Like, I think really, I think this is like my most relaxed interview.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of Students of Mind. To follow the work of Cristina and Mia, be sure to check the description of the episode. You can also find links to resources and more information about PTSD, trauma, and some of the other specific things that were mentioned in the episode. If you want to see more of Students of Mind, you can follow us on Instagram at Students of Mind, and you can follow me on Instagram at Jayde M. Barber for a more personal look into my mental health journey. I hope you learned something new today, and I look forward to sharing more with you next episode.